Good afternoon. My name's Ihata and I'm from Musashino University in Tokyo. I'd like to talk to you about the contemporary detective novel and how it portrays the social and linguistic diversity in modern Britain. I myself became aware of this as I read a lot of these novels, and I realised how much I am learning about modern society as I live in Japan and have little opportunity to get back to Britain. I'm going to be looking at the background in terms of classic British detective fiction and how things have changed in the contemporary works, how they reflect the diversity of modern Britain, focusing on three areas: locations, society and lifestyles, and use of language. And I will be discussing the significance of the new diversity in the genre as I go along. First of all, let me look at the historical models, or what we might call the standards. These I have divided into three periods. The old masters, the very beginnings of the genre, with Wilkie Collins being credited as the author of the first modern English detective novel, his novel Moonstone, published in 1868. And soon after, of course, he's followed by Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes stories. Interestingly enough, there are only 4 Sherlock Holmes novels. Most of the stories are actually short stories. We then have the interwar years, which are known as the golden age of crime fiction, and star 4 female authors known as the Queens of Crime: Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Ngaio Marsh, and Marjorie Allingham, who is not mentioned here because I think her books are less well known today. We begin in 1920 with Agatha Christie's mysterious affair at Styles, which introduces us to the great Hercule Poirot. These authors are also innovating. Hercule Poirot was a refugee, a foreigner. This is quite a new departure. Jane Marple, her other great character, is to begin with female, elderly and not very active. Dorothy Sayers introduced Lord Peter Wimsey, but she also gave him a partner, Harriet Vane, who stars in her own stories and teams up with Peter Wimsey to become his wife eventually. Ngaio Marsh wrote a very long series about Inspector Roderick Alleyn. All of these works so far are very much middle or upper class reflections, typically taking place in country houses. The working class are only mentioned as servants, as sort of bit characters in the plays, as it were. And when we come on to their great successors, P.D. James and Ruth Rendell being the new Queens of Crime from the early 1960s. We have Adam Dalgleish and Cordelia Gray. Cordelia Gray is one of the first sort of star female detectives, a young woman. She's a bit of a departure in that she has not been to Oxbridge, but nonetheless this is seen to be because of financial reasons, not her family background. Inspector Wexford is fairly comfortably middle class. Inspector Morse is a slight departure. His father was a taxi driver, and yet Inspector Morse himself has made it into the middle class and is quite comfortable there. So class and their attributes are something, lifestyles with servants and country houses. These are things that are going to be seen to be changing as we move on to the modern era. Before we do that, I'm going to be talking about diversity of location first. So let me briefly go through this map with you. Right at the top, where you can't see it because it's off the map, we have the Shetland Islands. We have the Hebrides to the west of Scotland there. The yellow Western Isles are part of the Hebrides down the west coast of Scotland. We have Scotland with Edinburgh and Glasgow cities being mentioned. We have Northern Ireland to the west, and as we move south we have Northumberland, Cumbria, Durham, Yorkshire. Lancashire, in the south of Lancashire we have Manchester. To the east and south we have Lincolnshire and Norfolk, the Fen country. We have the West Midlands in the centre of England, and to the west Wales. Down south we have London and the home counties around London. And these are all places that will be mentioned. If we look at locations, the diversity of location is quite phenomenal. All 4 nations of the UK are represented. England has numerous regional detectives. Scotland is represented by McDermott's Karen Pirie and Lindsay Gordon. Jack Logan, Rankin's famous Inspector Rebus, and Anne Cleeves writes about the Shetlands. There are also novels about the Hebrides Islands. In Wales we have the Snowdonia murder mysteries. Northern Ireland has a very long series set in Belfast. England, it seems all regions may be represented. So I'm just going to leave you to look at them. Quite well-known writers are Beckham with his Skelgill series in Cumbria, Peter Robinson's series and Dalglish's, which are both set in Yorkshire, Angela Marston's Kim Stone, set in the West Midlands, Inspector Morse in the home counties, Ellis's Nicky Galena in the Fens, Ellie Griffiths with Dr. Ruth Galloway in the Norfolk Fens. Also Dalglish has a Norfolk series, and quite a modern writer, Jane Isaac, with Detective Inspector Lavery in Hampshire. So as you can see, there's a very great deal of geographic locations that differ, and this is something that we really did not find in former times. It was very much home counties based. The area I'd like to look at is diversity in society and lifestyles, and this is an area in which we've seen a great deal of change compared to former times. To begin with gender, while it is true that there was development of roles for female characters, even in earlier writers, and it was growing, there's a lot more role for female lead detectives in the modern fiction, particularly in more recent works. They are reaching very high rank in the police force, not only detective chief inspector, but even superintendent rank. Of course, this is reflecting change in society itself, but also change within the genre, that this is seen as being acceptable in society and therefore acceptable within the writing. There is an LGBT presence, which certainly was not around very much before. There are 2 quite well-known gay or lesbian detectives. Inspector Ted Darling in L.M. Cryer's series of novels is gay, and the very first lesbian novel featured Lindsay Gordon, published by Val McDermott, herself a lesbian actually, but we do find much more of an LGBT presence, whether it is the detectives or other characters. In terms of lifestyle and relationships, of course there was change within the era of the 90s and so on. This was already beginning, but there is overlap here, and certainly it develops much more into the 2000s. Marriage is still seen as a sort of standard situation, but divorce and remarriage are common. They are nothing unusual. Even the somewhat traditional Inspector Banks in the Peter Robinson series divorces and his wife remarries and has a family with her new partner. Inspector Banks himself has an on-off relationship with a colleague. There are single mothers. Helen Lavery in Jane Isaac's books is a single mother and yet has the rank of Detective Chief Inspector. Ruth Galloway in the Ellie Griffiths series is a single mother, and her partner is married, still living with his family, and his wife and family are well aware of the child they share. This is quite a departure from former times. Class and family. We still have the middle class element, but the other classes are quite well represented. Several of the lead detectives are very clearly not of middle class origin. Cumbria's Skelgill and Scotland's Logan, Angela Marston's Kim Stone, very clearly not from a comfortable middle class background. Kim Stone is actually from a dysfunctional family. Her mother was an alcoholic who left Stone and her twin brother chained to a radiator for so long that the brother actually died. Other problems are alcoholism and drugs in the background. All of these, of course, represent changes that are happening in society, and the type of crime itself is also something that is changing as we progress. Language is much more diverse. The previous detectives, as I've mentioned, were educated middle class or upper class people. They spoke standard English. And while it's true that most of the lead detectives in contemporary fiction do speak standard English, non-standard English plays its part. Sometimes it's a secondary character or other characters in the novel, and it's introduced for local colour. One of Marston's characters, one of the key team of detectives, Stacey, has a broad Black Country or West Midlands accent, and several of the criminals, of course, do speak with such accents, and it's even referred to directly as being a feature of their character. Of course, sometimes the non-standard English is a particular character trait. This is true of the Cumbrian accent of Bruce Beckham's hero Skelgill, of J.J. Salkeld's characters Ian Mann and Owen Irving. Also the Scots character Detective Chief Inspector Logan in the J.D. Kirk stories. Their way of speaking is very, very much part of their character, and they would not be comfortable or be who they are without it. It's also a reflection of society. There is much more acceptance today of people with different accents. It's also part of the general diversification of society, in the sense that this diversity is accepted at higher and higher levels in the working world, in officialdom. This is perhaps partly because of the growth of higher education from the 1960s onwards, so that more and more people have the education necessary to be writing such fiction or to be introducing their background as their detectives. Of course, their economic situation improved for a lot of people who were originally from the working class. Inspector Morse, of great TV fame, is a very good example. He began from quite ordinary beginnings with a taxi driver father and became a middle-class lover of wine and classical music. And that concludes my brief talk about the contemporary detective novel. As I said, we have a great deal of diversity in many areas that did not exist before, and we can learn a lot about modern society from the reading of these novels, and I hope that I have inspired you to have a look at them. And list of the books that I have actually referred to, and anyone who would like a copy of this list is welcome to mail me, and I'm happy to share it with them. Meanwhile, I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for listening to me.